Hello, welcome to the Comments new collaborative project Espresso Global and Ukrainian Media. I'm Olena Solodovnikova and I'm excited to be joined by Peter Dickinson, an editor of Ukrainian Alert service at the Atlantic Council. Hello, Peter.
Hi.
Hi. I just wanted to talk at first about the latest news about the death of Alexei Navalny in Russian prison. And as for me, that doesn't matter. It's turned to be he was killed in prison, he was poisoned and another else. But what do you think about the world reaction to his death? Because he passed away before the start of the Russian elections. First of all, could you talk about that?
Well, I think that, of course, we don't know the details now, but obviously it's extremely suspicious that a relatively young man should, according to the Russian version, collapse suddenly and die. I'm sure the Russians will produce some sort of explanation, but I doubt that many people will be convinced. I assume, certainly my assumption, and I believe that the vast majority of people will share this, was that he was killed in one way or another. I think what it does, this death speaks of the sense of confidence in the Kremlin, how confident Putin is now that he's winning the war in Ukraine and that he's winning the war against the West. So he does not have to fear the Western reaction. I imagine that the removal of Navalny is something that the Kremlin has planned for a long time, and they've been waiting for the right moment. This is the right moment, and I think that's the key. That tells us a lot about the way that Putin is feeling at the moment, how empowered he feels, how emboldened he feels, and the sense of impunity he feels because he sees that the West is hesitating to support Ukraine, because he sees that the Republican Party in America is refusing to support Ukraine, is actually blocking aid to Ukraine. So Putin is looking at the world and thinking, well, I'm winning. No one's opposing me. I have nothing to fear, so I might as well remove my enemies.
Yes, but you talk about the right moment, and what about the perception of the USA, of the congressmen, about the decision of allocation of funds for Ukraine? What will be the perception of that?
Do you mean in terms of Navalny's killing?
Yep.
I think it will have no impact whatsoever.
So that is only about the Russian powerful, about that Russian became more and more tough, and they understand only the power of the USA. Yep.
Well, if the Republican Party in America, and specifically the Trump wing of the Republican Party, because this is what we're talking about, we're essentially talking about Donald Trump. If he is not convinced by the biggest invasion in Europe since Adolf Hitler, if he's not convinced to act because of this invasion and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, I don't think the death of a single Russian dissident in prison is going to change his mind.
Yes, but about the Trump, during his campaign speech in the South Carolina, he said he would be more to protect Ukraine than Biden. What made him change his mind, or he make flip-flop, or what game does he play?
Well, I think he's just making a statement there to try and deflect attention. Everybody knows that the block on aid in Congress is Trump's personal doing. Many of his own supporters say so directly. They've all said it's him. So now he's trying to avoid this somehow by saying, actually, no, I do support Ukraine, but I have issues about the border. I have issues about US debt, other excuses. But it's quite clear that Trump does not want to support Ukraine. We also see Putin saying, I don't support Trump now. Again, playing the same game, but it's very clear that Trump is siding with Putin and Putin is siding with Trump.
Yes, I'd like to ask you about the reaction of the world to the interview of Putin to Clarkson. What is your stance on it? What signs Putin gave to the USA, to all the other West?
Well, I think it was a very useful experience, actually. It was a very useful exercise. Before it happened, I was worried that it would become a dangerous propaganda tool, that the Russians could use it very effectively to promote, the most dangerous disinformation about the war. But actually, Putin, for whatever reason, maybe again because he's just totally detached from reality, chose to give a very long and very boring history lecture. Now, if you watched the interview,
yes, I watched. Unfortunately, I watched.
Many of us unfortunately watched it, but we had to. But if you watched it from the beginning, it was very clear from the very first question. The very first question, Tucker Carlson tried to steer Trump into blaming Putin tried to steer Putin into blaming America, blaming NATO. He said, well, it was them, right? Wasn't it them? He was giving what we call a very leading question. He was encouraging Putin to say, yes, it was NATO. And now I'll tell you why it's all America's fault. That was the purpose of the interview. And Tucker didn't mess around. He didn't try and hide it. He began immediately by saying this. That was his first question. It was America, it was NATO. And Putin said, well, actually, I have a different idea. And he started with this massive history lecture. Now, the history lecture itself was, of course, largely false, largely fake. It was full of outrageous lies and omissions and distortions. But really, that's not the main thing. I think that's kind of expected from Putin, that he's going to give a very distorted view of history. I think the main thing was, the most important thing, and I've spoken to some people about this who are not experts on the subject but watched the interview just because they were interested in seeing the spectacle. And they all said, but why did he do that? Why did he think that was a relevant thing to do? They were shocked that someone in that position would use this opportunity to go on a rant about things that happened, hundreds or even thousands of years ago, which are clearly not relevant to today's events. The idea that any war in the 21st century can be justified by events that happened in 1654 or 861 or whenever is absurd. So I think it was very useful in the sense that it exposed how far from our reality, from the certainly the Western reality, Putin is, how different his mindset is. Now, you can argue that he's right or wrong, but it's very important, I think, for Westerners to understand that they shouldn't judge him by their own rationality. He's not rational on their terms. He thinks very differently, has a very different worldview, and he is very much locked into this historical narrative. So it was extremely useful in that sense, and I think that's why now we're seeing both Tucker Carlson and Putin himself like trying to distance themselves a bit from this, to say, well, wasn't so good, wasn't so impressive, wasn't really it didn't go the way we wanted it to go, because they understand how damaging it was. And I think the final point I would make would be that, again, coming back to this NATO idea, that the main argument that Russia's apologists in the West have had since the war began has been this idea that, well, it's the West's fault. They've tended to say, yes, it's not good what Russia's doing. Obviously, it's not good that Russia is killing hundreds of thousands of people and destroying whole cities. We don't approve of that. But fundamentally, it's the West's fault. It's NATO's fault. It's America's fault. That's been their message. And Putin basically torpedoed that message, destroyed that message, and said, well, actually, it's not about NATO. It's not about the West. It's about history. And it's about the fact that Ukraine is mine. Ukraine belongs to Russia. And I have every right to go in there and take it over because it belongs to me historically. Now, that is a very different narrative, and it's not something that many people in the West would support. So in that sense, it was a real victory for the Western narrative, or for simply for common sense, I would say.
And in terms of NATO, John Bolton said that Trump pulled tried to pull the USA from NATO in 2018. And how do you estimate the risks that if he wins elections, he will pull the USA from the NATO? And what will be with the world order in this case?
Well, this is a risk, but I think it's something that people don't fully understand yet. They don't fully understand how big the risk is. The U.S. Congress recently passed a bill, passed a legislation saying that the president does not have the authority to unilaterally remove the US from NATO. Clearly aimed at Trump, clearly because they see that he may well become president and they're afraid that he will try and do this. So they're trying to legislate against that, to block that, to create barriers to prevent him from being able to do that. But that's not really the issue. NATO is based on deterrent, and it's based on the belief that NATO will act, that the United States, first and foremost, will act on Article 5 of the NATO Constitution, which obliges all countries to defend any member which is under attack. That's the fundamental principle on which NATO, that's the foundation on which NATO stands, on which NATO is built. It's the whole point of NATO. Now, Trump can keep America in NATO, but if he doesn't act on Article 5, if he hesitates, if he says, well, let's see, if, for example, Russia instigates unrest in Narva or some other Estonian or Latvian border city and says, oh, it's not us, it's some local people, we don't know who they are, you know, little green men scenario, Crimea scenario, Donbass scenario. They'll instigate a little bit of upset and then they'll say, well, Russians are being killed. Well, we have to act. So in we go. Well, we're not here to occupy, we're just here as peacekeepers, etc., etc. They'll go on very slow. Russia won't launch a massive invasion. They won't do what they did in 2022 in Ukraine. They'll do what they did in Crimea or what they did in Donbass in 2014 or something similar to that. And then the challenge will be to NATO, do we start a war with Russia over this? And that's when Trump will come in and say no. And at that point, NATO ceases to be a realistic and a functioning military alliance, because the founding principle of NATO, Article 5, the defense of one is the defense of all, will have been shattered. So that's all he needs to do. He doesn't need to withdraw from NATO. He doesn't need to pull America officially out of NATO. He needs to discredit NATO. And he's quite capable of doing that. He's very capable of doing that. All it will require is provocation from the Russian side.